They walked morning after morning through streets emptied of laughter, their feet echoing on stones slick with damp, as if the world itself withdrew into hush. In those times when death roamed like a shadow, life contracted into the narrow hours between fear and necessity, and every breath measured itself against the hush of absence. In the days of the Justinian plague, when beleaguered cities along the Mediterranean felt thin as paper under the weight of pestilence, people rose before dawn to tend the famished, to cart away bodies too heavy to ignore, dragging sacks of cloth around corners, murmuring names they could not remember, and in that grey light, life felt brittle, as though the sky itself were holding its breath. Markets that once teemed were now skeletal, baskets half full, goats bleating in their pens, the stall of fish left untouched, vendors wrapped in cloaks, eyes dull, watching the sun rise slowly and wondering whether any neighbour would survive until dusk. Rumours travelled faster than the disease, whispers of buboes swelling black, of breath labouring, of veins darkening under skin. Children shrank into corners, mothers pressed bandages soaked in herbs to foreheads, priests chanted in courtyards emptied of pilgrims. In Constantinople, as the bodies piled in the streets, walls reeked of rot, and the air trembled with moans. Over months, the dead outnumbered the living in many quarters. Survivors buried kin in mass graves, hastened by workers paid a handful of coins, or nothing at all, and sometimes tossed into pits, with no prayers. The plague changed the nature of daily time. Days collapsed, nights stretched. Fear hollowed every moment. From city centres to rural outposts, the pestilence found pathways through trade, through cloth, through skin. In Alexandria, the call to prayer rang through streets half silent. In Antioch, shopkeepers closed early, slipping home before the sickly winds rose. In Ravenna, whole districts vanished from the rolls of the living. And yet the daily motions continued for some. Bakers rose early, not knowing if the dough they kneaded would be eaten or left to spoil. Washerwomen boiled linens, hands raw, ears pricked for the cough of a child. Scribes copied death tallies in dim rooms, the ink trembling under candlelight. The rhythm of plague became a rhythm of waiting, of bracing, of watching windows for the figure who did not return. As the first pandemic subsided, scars remained. A quieter marketplace, fewer mouths at the table, temples where no one stepped for weeks. But memory clung, passed through stories muttered in kitchens, warnings etched into stone, prayers altered by fear. Centuries later, it began again, but darker, deeper, the Black Death. It came in from the east on ships, on caravans, on breath, and across Europe it moved like water poured from a cracked bowl. In the hills of Italy, in the muddy lanes of England, in the vineyards of France, people felt it arrive before it was seen. An unease in the air, a silence between birdsong, the sudden flight of rats from barns. By the time symptoms showed, it was too late. The swellings, the fevers, the bleeding mouths, families barred doors not to protect what they had, but to slow the time of their own becoming. Priests came less often. Carters pulled wagons of dead through alleys. In Florence, bodies were stacked in courtyards like cordwood. In London, entire households vanished in a week. Churches rang their bells until the ropes frayed. Cities enforced quarantines, but the plague crept in like fog. In villages, a cow lowed unanswered for days before collapsing in its pen. Children, orphaned and hungry, walked roads aimlessly until they disappeared. Amid the fear, explanations flourished. Bad air, divine punishment, the stars, the Jews. Pogroms erupted as panic turned on scapegoats. Meanwhile, doctors donned masks filled with herbs, long beaks like birds, more for fear than function. In kitchens, people boiled rosemary, sage, vinegar, hoping scent might shield the lungs. Every day became a calculus. Do you go to market knowing what might await? Do you visit the neighbour who coughs? Do you light a candle for the dead or for the living? Time slowed, stretched, fragmented. People stopped measuring by the hour, and instead by who was left. But from this darkness too, life did not vanish, it changed. Labourers, once bound by feudal laws, found their labour newly valuable. Wages rose, fields were abandoned, then claimed anew. Cities rebuilt, more cautiously, but no one forgot. Not in their bones, not in their stories, not in the way they looked at one another over a shared meal. Always wondering, quietly, who would disappear next. In the spaces left behind by those absences, life reshaped itself in quiet ways, not through declarations or grand acts of renewal, but through the subtle persistence of routine returned, through the sound of a pot being stirred in a kitchen where silence had lingered too long, through the careful reopening of shutters that had stayed closed against the black flags of sickness. And though plague had scorched the land, and though the shadow of death still clung to the walls, people walked again through their gardens and felt the weight of the sun on their backs as something real and alive, if still fragile. In the centuries that followed, death did not recede so much as reposition itself, quieter now but ever present, watching through candlelight and wood smoke as smaller waves of pestilence returned like fading echoes. And then in the crowded neighbourhoods of growing cities like London and Paris and later Calcutta and Shanghai, as industrial smoke poured into the skies and trains stitched the continents into tighter grids. Disease moved not only with caravans and ships, but with steam and soot and the press of shoulders in factory lines and the breath shared on carriages and omnibus benches. In the tenements of the 19th century, disease did not come with the shock of apocalypse, but with the slow erosion of breath and strength, and cholera, that blue-lipped thief, became the terror of the working poor. In London, families lived 5 to a room with shared latrines in courtyards, the waste flowing into rivers that shimmered with disease, and when the great stink of 1858 rose from the Thames, the stench was so strong, Parliament had to shutter its windows with soaked cloth. And still the death toll climbed. Mothers bathed children in tin basins, pouring ladles of boiled water over heads, while praying that tonight the cough would not return, that the groaning child would not still before dawn. In hospitals, nurses worked in rows of cots where patients lay delirious and fevered, the smell of lye and sweat saturating the walls. Elsewhere, in the hills of Bengal and the delta of the Ganges, outbreaks burned through villages without even the benefit of rumour to precede them. One day, the fields were full of women harvesting rice, and the next, the houses were shuttered and the fields went quiet, birds circling above them in uneasy flocks. Colonial authorities measured the deaths in charts and estimates, in surveys of supply chains and water tables, and issued proclamations from offices cooled by fans, while men and women outside the walls dug shallow graves in hard ground. In port cities like Hong Kong and Bombay, the third Great Plague pandemic arrived aboard ships with infected rats and fleas, and between 1894 and the early decades of the 20th century, the disease traced the circuits of empire itself, carried along rail lines and steamers, from soldier to worker, from dock to market. Quarantine camps were established, where families were separated, belongings burned, entire neighbourhoods razed in the hope that fire might do what prayers had not. In Hong Kong, in the crowded alleys of Taiping Shan, inspectors in white suits and masks moved from house to house, ordering the sick removed and the living inspected, and resentment grew not only for the disease but for the indignity of how it was handled, for the sense that the poor bore the weight not just of plague, but of policy. In India, colonial doctors mapped outbreaks with coloured pins on paper maps, but in the villages, those colours meant nothing. What mattered was the sound of coughing behind thin walls, the hurried footsteps of the healthy trying to leave before being marked, the sight of cows wandering untethered because their owners had vanished in the night. In crowded homes, grandmothers told stories from older times of gods and spirits and protective charms, and pasted amulets on lintels as if to ward off what science could not. The science itself, of course, was growing. The microscope became a battlefield in miniature, and Yersinia pestis was named and studied, and vaccines developed, albeit unevenly, and still the death toll rose. In the wake of all this came the year 1918, when war had already turned the world inside out, and the flu swept through it like a second scythe. Soldiers in the trenches of France coughed blood into rags, and still climbed over the top the next morning. Nurses in makeshift hospitals worked 12 hours on, 12 hours off, walking between beds where young men who had survived gas attacks and shrapnel now drowned in their own lungs. In America, it began quietly. Fort Riley, Kansas, and spread with the mobilization of troops, carried in troop ships and across parades, through victory celebrations and into tenement blocks where people crowded around radios and phonographs, coughing. In Philadelphia, a parade turned into a funeral. In India, where famine already stalked the land, the flu took tens of millions. There were not enough fires to cremate the dead. In cities across the world, the story repeated. No space in the morgue, no nurses left uninfected, no clean cloth. Families marked their homes with chalk to signal illness inside. Newspapers printed advice on fresh air, on keeping windows open, on avoiding gatherings. But the virus did not care for advice. It took the young and strong. In the evenings, silence again became the dominant sound. Carriages without drivers, bread ovens cold, bells tolling. In the aftermath, when the fires were out and the survivors counted, people barely spoke of it, as if naming it might call it back. The world pivoted instead to rebuilding, to forgetting, to roaring 20s and modernity. But beneath that rush was a stratum of memory lined with the weight of those lost. In quiet households, in the fading smell of camphor and burnt gauze, in the long silence after a child's name was spoken and no one answered, the flu lingered not as fear but as absence. And even as the 20th century surged forward, layering itself in steel and circuitry, disease remained in the bloodstream of human movement, hidden in the margins of headlines, tucked beneath the illusion of control. And by mid-century, new forms of illness began to travel with the velocity of jet engines and the complexity of global trade. And the promise of antibiotics and vaccines brought both relief and overconfidence, as if the era of pandemics might be past, yet in crowded urban centres, in refugee camps, in post-war slums and expanding cities, pressed tight with industry and inequality, microbes still found their way, mutating, travelling, waiting. In 1957, the Asian flu emerged from East Asia, a quiet ripple that became a wave, cresting through schools and universities, through army barracks and suburban homes, where mothers read the news and felt a chill at the familiar patterns, the same reports of cough, of fever, of sudden death. Hospitals scrambled to prepare, children were kept home, some never returning to class. In offices, employees wore masks and wrote memos through illness, while others vanished from their desks for good. In villages, the flu was another burden atop many. Bad harvests, rising prices, political change, and it passed like smoke, leaving weakened bodies and empty chairs at dinner tables. A decade later, in 1968, the Hong Kong flu brought another turn of the wheel. Familiar now, predictable only in its cruelty, and cities staggered once more. In apartment towers and sprawling complexes, families waited for medicine that ran low, for doctors stretched thin, for news that came late. The world, more connected now, watched the virus arc from continent to continent, and yet the machinery of daily life continued, slowed but not stopped. Trains still ran, planes still flew, people still gathered, and the virus moved among them like an unseen guest. Children grew up during these years with vague memories of masks and closures, of the smell of disinfectant and the silence of locked doors, and in their adulthood they would remember these things again, differently. For even as medical science advanced, so too did the complexities of the modern world. The density of cities, the speed of movement, the widening gap between rich and poor. And in this new matrix, the stage was set for what came at the close of the century. A different kind of pandemic. Not spread by droplets in the air, but by blood, by intimacy, by silence. When HIV emerged in the 1980s, it was not at first seen as a global catastrophe. It began as a whisper, as a set of symptoms observed in clusters, dismissed or misdiagnosed, and by the time it was understood, it had already seeded itself deeply. In hospitals and clinics, in nightclubs and neighbourhoods, in the blood banks and the unspoken spaces of the world, the virus waited. In cities like San Francisco and New York, whole communities began to vanish. Young men who had danced together weeks earlier now sat skeletal in hospital beds, watched by friends too afraid to touch them, or too defiant not to. In Africa, in villages already strained by poverty, by conflict, by drought, the virus moved with devastating efficiency. Mothers passed it unknowingly to children, husbands to wives, blood to blood, breath to breath. It was a different kind of death, not sudden but slow, eroding identity, sapping strength, visible in the mirror day by day. The pandemic exposed fault lines not only in medicine, but in culture, in politics, in empathy. In some nations, victims were blamed, in others, ignored. Stigma became as lethal as the virus itself. And yet, as before, amid the collapse of certainty, life reshaped itself again. Activists rose, nurses worked without protective gear, because no one else would. Friends became caregivers. Communities forged rituals of mourning when funerals were shunned. Quilts were stitched with names. Protests erupted for medicine, for recognition, for humanity. The medical establishment, slow at first, rallied. Antiretrovirals were developed. Hope flickered. But by then, millions were gone. And the world had learned again that pandemics do not only destroy bodies, they reveal who we are, what we value, what we fear. As the 21st century dawned, with satellites in orbit and the internet humming in every corner, the illusion of safety returned for a time. Vaccines were widespread. Travel was routine. Illness, though never vanquished, seemed distant. Then came SARS in 2003, a warning shot, sharp and swift. In hospitals across East Asia, healthcare workers fell ill, some dying within days. Quarantine returned. Airports pulsed with anxiety. In Hong Kong, apartment complexes were sealed off. Entire buildings turned into quarantine zones. But the world moved. Quickly this time, cases isolated, travel limited, the outbreak contained. Relief returned, but so too did complacency. For though SARS was stopped, the lesson was not held. Over the next decade, smaller outbreaks flared. Avian flu, swine flu, Ebola. But each time the pattern repeated, fear, then forgetfulness, until the cycle turned again, and the world, busy and digital, paused under a sky gone eerily quiet. It began, as so many times before, with whispers, with headlines distant and foreign, a sickness spreading somewhere else, across an ocean, on a map, in a city whose name was unfamiliar to most, and for a moment it felt like the stories of before, not of now, and people went about their lives as they always had, rushing through subways, passing each other in crowded markets, sharing meals in restaurants lit by warm bulbs and the clinking of glasses, and then suddenly everything slowed, then stopped, not with the dramatic clang of war or the tremble of an earthquake, but with silence, with cancellations, with the quiet locking of doors and the persistent murmur of uncertainty. COVID-19 moved like memory, slowly at first, then all at once, and the world, once too large to fully imagine, shrank to the size of homes, of rooms, of glowing screens. In city after city, lights stayed off in office towers, sidewalks emptied, planes grounded. Families stood behind glass to see one another. Grandparents waved from balconies. Supermarket shelves emptied as fear spread quicker than fact. Hospitals became front lines, and nurses once anonymous were now warriors in plastic armour, faces bruised from masks, eyes ringed with exhaustion. Refrigerated trucks turned into morgues. News anchors wore solemn faces. Numbers rolled across screens like stock tickers of the dead. And in the quiet, a new kind of daily life took root, measured in delivery windows, Zoom calls, sanitised doorknobs, the cautious calculus of errands, the strange intimacy of solitude. Children learned through screens. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Funerals streamed on tablets, held by trembling hands. For many, the virus came with fever, with breathlessness, with isolation in rooms where the only voices were on the phone or behind a window. Others felt it only in absence, the lost job, the vanished friend, the silence where once there had been plans. Cities echoed with sirens instead of song. The rhythm of life became strange and disjointed. Weeks blended, holidays felt unreal. Seasons passed behind windows. In countries where infrastructure buckled, the burden was heavier still. Oxygen in short supply, vaccines delayed, fear unchecked. And yet again, just as in centuries past, the effects were uneven. Some worked from home in safety, others cleaned those homes in danger. Some were cheered as heroes, while others were left unprotected, invisible. Around the world, conspiracy mingled with despair, politics infected with panic. Misinformation flowed faster than antibodies. And still, amid all of it, people adapted. Musicians played to empty streets, their notes bouncing off silent walls. Strangers left food on porches, teachers turned bedrooms into classrooms. Seamstresses sewed masks when there were none. Lovers wrote letters again. Rituals changed, weddings over livestream, vigils with candles in driveways. Graduations honked from parked cars. In parks, people found space to breathe behind cloth. In forests, animals wandered onto roads that had forgotten cars. In the absence of routine, time unravelled. Calendars became abstract, and people marked days by case numbers, by graphs, by the shifting rules of lockdown tiers. Some counted the toll in numbers, others in memories. The restaurant that never reopened, the neighbour who vanished from the window, the child who forgot what school felt like. And when the vaccine arrived, it brought hope not as a surge, but as a trickle. First to the elderly, the doctors, the vulnerable, and slowly people began to gather again, cautiously, masked, hesitant. Hugs returned, uncertain at first, then tighter. Laughter echoed again in outdoor cafes, in playgrounds, in reopened libraries. But the shadow had lengthened, and it did not depart easily. Long COVID lingered. Grief persisted. There were those who survived but were not the same. And as restrictions lifted, as travel resumed, many could not go back to how things were before, because now they knew how fragile it all was, how quickly a handshake could become dangerous, how silence could fill a city like floodwater. And so, like every generation that came before, they remembered in small ways, in the hand sanitizer still clipped to bags, in the masks still kept in drawers, in the cautious pause before entering a crowd. They remembered in poems, in empty chairs at the table, in the softness of reuniting. And just like in the past, the story moved forward, not with grand announcements, but with the quiet resumption of ordinary life. Morning coffee brewed again in office break rooms, children laughing behind school gates, couples planning futures again. Yet all of it, every part of it, now held an echo. The pandemic, like all the ones before, had inscribed itself into the fabric of life, not just as tragedy, but as transformation. Not just as fear, but as a reminder of how deeply connected all lives are, across borders, across histories, through the shared and fragile breath of being human. And even as the dust began to settle from the most recent storm, and the masks slowly became optional in shops and offices, the memory of it all still pulsed just beneath the surface, like a bruise not yet faded, a lesson half learned, and people looked backward and forward at once, tracing the arc not just of the last few years, but of centuries, of patterns repeating under different skies, different clothes, different names, but the same fears, the same rituals of retreat and recovery. It was impossible not to draw comparisons, not to wonder how the people of Constantinople felt when the plague carts rolled through their marble streets, or how a London family huddled by candlelight during the Black Death, or how a mother in rural India in 1918 cradled her fevered child with no doctor within days' reach, hoping for a mercy that rarely came. The thread that wound through it all was not the death but the living, those who stayed, who endured, who remembered. In every era, the burden of caregiving fell heavily on those closest. The mothers wiping brows with wet cloths, the nurses whose hands cracked from washing, the sons who dug graves for their fathers, the midwives who crossed dangerous neighbourhoods to deliver babies born in the shadow of contagion. Even in times of fear, people moved toward one another. They brought soup to doorsteps. They left notes of comfort. They whispered prayers through walls, and though the histories often record the numbers, the curves, the policies, it is in those small movements that the real stories are kept. The way a candle flickered beside a sickbed, the way a teacher taught through a window, the way a child, too young to understand the word quarantine, traced drawings on fogged-up glass, waiting for the world to come back. The rituals evolved, but the essence remained. To survive together, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and every time a pandemic passed, people emerged changed. Not just in what they valued, but in how they saw time, mortality, connection. Festivals became sweeter, meals slower, hugs longer, and for a while fear receded, becoming memory, until memory softened, becoming story, until story faded, becoming silence, and then it would happen again. Each era brought new vectors, new understandings, new defences, but the emotional core remained constant. The ache of uncertainty, the weight of helplessness, the stubborn resilience of hope. And so it is not a straight line, but a circle, a spiral, looping through empires and villages, through monasteries and modern cities, always reminding, always testing. The lessons too repeated, the importance of clean water, of shared information, of preparedness, of compassion. But often, between outbreaks, these lessons slipped into complacency. Funding dried up, awareness waned, priorities shifted. After the Black Death, medical boards were formed, cities kept watch over public hygiene. After cholera, sewers were rebuilt. After 1918, global surveillance improved. After HIV, public health outreach became more inclusive. After COVID, remote work and digital medicine redefined labour and care. But in each case, the push to return to normal was strong, even when normal had failed so many. And always, in the quiet between the waves, there were those who never fully returned, those who lost someone irreplaceable, those who lived with long-term effects, those whose view of the world had tilted just enough to make it feel unfamiliar. The historians recorded causes, vectors, transmission rates, and death tolls, but in journals and diaries and oral traditions, another layer lived, of dreams deferred, of weddings postponed, of letters never sent, of lullabies sung through tears. There are letters from Roman times describing the plague in almost the same language as those from Elizabethan England, from Civil War-era America, from a nurse's blog in Wuhan. Always the disbelief, the struggle to accept, the search for meaning, the yearning for routine. Always the hope that this time, perhaps, would be the last. But pandemics are not punishments nor prophecies. They are part of the ecology of life, emerging from the very connections that sustain us. Trade, travel, interaction. The more we weave ourselves together, the more the threads carry not just goods and ideas, but also bacteria, viruses, the invisible passengers of progress. And yet, this same interconnection is what allows for recovery too, for shared science, for international aid, for global mourning and resilience. In the 21st century, news of an outbreak can cross oceans in seconds. but so too can the research, the advice, the solidarity. A doctor in Nairobi can read the latest findings from Paris. A mother in Sao Paulo can watch videos from Seoul on how to comfort. A child with fever, a village in Nepal can receive vaccines manufactured in Belgium. The danger moves faster, but so does the defence. And as the world continues to change, climate shifting, populations growing, new pathogens waiting in forests disturbed or animals consumed, the challenge will remain not only biological, but human. How to hold on to the lessons, how to build systems, not just of science but of compassion, how to ensure that in the next wave, fewer are left behind. Because the story of pandemics is also the story of inequality, of who gets treated and who does not, of which communities are protected and which are ignored. From ancient cities to modern megacities, this pattern persists, and unless it is addressed, the cycles will not only continue, but worsen. But there is hope too, in the archives of what came before, in the memory of how people adapted, in the tireless work of those who hold the line in every era. Every time the world darkened, someone lit a candle. Every time the streets emptied, someone played music from a balcony. Every time hands were forced apart, voices reached across the silence. This is how humanity has always continued, not unscarred, but undiminished. And still the rhythm of recovery remained uneven, some returning to old patterns with ease, while others found the familiar, now alien. The weight of what had been lost or learned pressing invisibly against their movements, and, in that quiet aftershock, many began to trace the long arc of disease in history, not merely as a list of plagues, but as a hidden architecture beneath the structures of civilization itself, shaping cities, guiding borders, influencing art, policy, faith. The oldest cities were often born beside water, not only for trade, but because clean water meant fewer deaths, and aqueducts were acts of public health as much as engineering. The spacing of streets, the placement of cemeteries, the traditions of public bathing, all bore traces of past plagues. Even the language carried echoes. Quarantine from the 40-day ships were once held offshore. Influenza from the stars believed to guide fate. Virus from the Latin for poison. And over time, as understanding deepened, as science replaced superstition, the emotional truth remained strangely constant. The fear of the invisible, the grief of the sudden, the fragility of breath. Across all these moments, in palaces and slums, people turned to the same instincts, to isolate, to cleanse, to explain, to preserve. Some through faith, others through reason, but all through ritual, because ritual gave shape to what could not be controlled. In medieval Europe, flagellants walked the roads, believing self-punishment might appease divine wrath. In early 20th century Africa, communities danced in healing circles, mixing prayer with motion. In modern cities, clapping from balconies became its own liturgy, a ritual of recognition, of shared gratitude, of endurance. And as those patterns repeated, so too did the hidden toll, not just of bodies lost, but of trust eroded. In plague after plague, suspicion grew, of foreigners, of neighbours, of the state, of the stranger coughing on the corner. Sometimes this fear turned violent, as during the Black Death, when Jewish communities were blamed and slaughtered. Sometimes it turned inward, manifesting in hoarding, in silence, in resignation. But always there were those who resisted that collapse into isolation, not by denying the danger, but by leaning into connection. They wrote letters, they drew art, they formed care networks, they documented what others ignored. And through their work, we know not just how many died, but how people lived while dying. In the 1665 London plague, Samuel Pepys wrote of empty streets and buried hopes. In the 1918 flu, letters from nurses described the weight of holding hands through final breaths. In the early years of HIV, artists painted with fury and tenderness. During COVID, social media feeds filled with poems, recipes, live-streamed concerts, digital funerals. The modes changed, but the impulse was the same. to leave a trace, to insist that this too was life, even in its most uncertain form. And looking further back still, before writing, before cities, before medicine as we know it, archaeological sites show signs of sudden absence. Villages abandoned, cemeteries swelling in a single layer, clues that some catastrophe passed through. The bones do not tell stories, but the layers do. At one site in Anatolia, mass graves reveal a sudden spike in child deaths around 5,000 years ago, likely from an early epidemic. At another in Egypt, workers' tombs cluster tightly around the same years, suggesting a community decimated. These early pandemics left no diaries, but they left silence in the earth, and the silence is telling. It shows how deeply human this cycle is, how disease has always walked beside us, not as punishment, not as anomaly, but as companion in the dance of complexity. Because to build, to travel, to gather, to love, all these things create pathways for connection and contagion alike. And still we build, still we gather, still we risk. That is the defiance and the beauty of it, that every time the world seemed to close in, people found a way to open again. The legacy of pandemics is not only the damage, but the adaptation. The hospitals built, the policies reformed, the songs remembered, the sciences born of desperation. Each time something was added to the human repertoire, a technique, a tool, a turn of phrase. And though it may seem bleak to recount plague after plague, what emerges instead is a kind of strange tenderness, a recognition of our vulnerability, yes, but also of our resilience, our capacity to hold on to one another in the face of unknowing. The nurse in Milan in 1629, wiping brows with rosemary oil, is not so different from the doctor in Jakarta in 2020, adjusting a mask with trembling fingers. The parent in ancient Mesopotamia, burying a child with carved amulets, carries the same sorrow as the father in Sao Paulo, clutching a photograph outside a locked ward. Across time, the rituals of mourning may differ, but the ache is the same. The love is the same. The insistence on meaning is the same. And from that insistence comes culture, comes memory, comes the decision to rebuild yet again. Not because it is easy, but because to not rebuild is to surrender to silence. And silence, for all its stillness, is not life. And when the silence lifted, as it always does, it did so not with fanfare, but with the creaking open of long-closed shutters, with the tentative footsteps of people returning to places they once moved through without thought. The baker wiping down a counter that had gathered dust. The teacher drawing shapes on a blackboard before students slowly filled the room again. The old man unlocking a shuttered cafe and standing for a long moment at the door before stepping inside. And in these small acts, the world began again, unevenly, cautiously, but with the same instinct that had guided survivors for millennia. The need to reassemble what had been broken, to reclaim what could be reclaimed, to carry forward what could not. In every age that return had looked different, shaped by the tools of the time, the scale of the loss, the beliefs of the people, but the pattern remained, mourning, reckoning, rebuilding. After the Antonine Plague in ancient Rome, temples filled with new prayers, medicine adapted Greek theory with urgency, and the empire reeled from the weakening of its legions. After the plague of Cyprian, early Christian communities grew stronger, bound by their role in caregiving, their steadfast presence among the dying when others fled. After the Black Death, European cities rewrote their public health laws, forming early sanitation boards, regulating movement, punishing non-compliance, yet also fostering a cultural renaissance in the wake of such massive death, art turning toward the body, the transient, the divine. After cholera outbreaks, entire cities were redesigned, boulevards widened, sewage redirected, water systems engineered with a new reverence for flow and cleanliness, and the maps of Paris, of London, of Mumbai bear the imprint still. After the 1918 flu, the world rushed to forget, too exhausted from war and death to look back for long. But seeds were planted, public health departments expanded, hospitals modernised, epidemiology took clearer form. And in each case, the next generation inherited not only buildings and policies, but a subtle awareness in the collective nervous system, a readiness just under the skin. That readiness waxed and waned, reshaped by prosperity or peace, dulled by distance from the last outbreak, but it never vanished. It stirred in drills, in archived protocols, in the muscle memory of those who had lived through the last wave. In homes, people saved extra canned goods, not because they needed to, but because once it had made the difference. In neighbourhoods, elders passed on stories, not always detailed, but enough to sketch the contours of what had been survived. A grandmother might mention the year the schools closed, or the time everyone wore masks, or the day the market ran out of flour, and the child listening might not understand yet, but the memory settled into them like a seed. These seeds sprouted in unexpected ways, in cautious habits, in compassionate instincts, in the quiet belief that care for others was not optional. And so the world, always vulnerable, also became more capable, not immune but better prepared. That preparedness did not prevent the next pandemic, but it changed how people met it. The scientists who decoded genomes in hours had trained during Ebola. The nurses who comforted COVID patients had once studied SARS. The systems that tracked outbreaks globally had been conceived in the ashes of earlier failures. Still, there was no perfection, only better tools, and the tools were only as good as the willingness to use them. This, too, had always been true. In 14th century Venice, quarantine worked only when enforced. In 19th century New York, cholera maps helped only when officials believed the data. In 1980s Uganda, grassroots education campaigns curbed HIV more than foreign doctors did. The success of any defence relied not only on knowledge, but on belief, on trust, on solidarity. And trust was always hardest to maintain in crisis. Each pandemic tested it, between citizens and leaders, between nations, between neighbours. Rumours filled the gaps where truth faltered. In sometimes people turned inward. In others, they reached outward. The outcome depended not on the pathogen, but on the people. And yet across all eras, despite failures and betrayals and losses, there were always those who stood firm. Doctors who refused to abandon their posts. Writers who recorded what others denied. Communities that organised care when governments would not. These were the threads that held the fabric together, thin but resilient. And in every age, their names were often lost, but their acts were not. The way a body was buried with dignity, the way a meal was shared despite scarcity, the way music was played for the dying. These moments multiplied across time and became a kind of resistance, not to disease itself, which cannot be reasoned with, but to despair. They reminded the living that life, however imperiled, was still worth tending. That love, however brief, still mattered. That even in isolation, people remained linked by more than breath. And in those truths, generation after generation found their footing again. The cities rebuilt. The art shifted. The politics changed. The memories lingered. The children who asked why things had changed grew up with answers shaped by the time that came before, and they carried those answers forward, sometimes as caution, sometimes as resolve, sometimes as quiet grief. And the cycle continued, and the cycle, relentless though it was, never returned in quite the same shape, never asked the same questions or offered the same choices, for each age wore its own skin, its own tools and fears and myths, and though the core experience echoed, illness, fear, isolation, endurance, the details shifted, like light through stained glass, colouring memory with different hues each time. And in that variation, the story of humanity in plague deepened, not as a single thread, but as a tapestry woven with uneven hands across centuries. In the ancient world, a plague might be read as divine judgment, the gods angry at sacrilege, and so the people would offer sacrifice, build new temples, pray harder, burn incense not just for scent but for cleansing air of invisible sins. While in the early modern world, it was miasma they feared, the foul breath of swamps or the rot of the poor, and cities hired fumigators to carry smoke through alleys, to perfume the air with chemicals and hope. Later came the age of microbes, of science straining to name and map the invisible, and with it came vaccines, antibiotics, hospitals built not only to quarantine, but to cure. Yet even then, the human response remained as emotional as it was rational, and policies still clashed with belief, trust still frayed in the heat of panic. The pattern was not linear but layered, and so the people of each generation looked backward even as they moved forward. During the Spanish flu, newspapers quoted medieval chronicles. During COVID, the word plague trended again. In every era, the past became a mirror, sometimes comforting, sometimes accusatory, always instructive. And in that mirror, people recognized themselves not as unique victims, but as part of a long continuum of breath and blood, and fear and survival. The physicians of Baghdad in the 9th century, scribbling treatment notes in the margins of translated texts, had the same urgency as the ER doctor in Bergamo, scribbling vitals onto PPE-stained gloves. The family in a hut in 6th century Ethiopia, avoiding a neighbouring village, was not so different from the suburban household cancelling a wedding in 2020. The scale changed, but the human centre did not. And in tracing that centre, historians learned to look not only at numbers, but at the spaces between them, at who was left out, at what was forgotten, at whose stories were preserved, and whose were erased. Because pandemics reveal, and they also conceal. In every outbreak, some voices grew louder. Scientists, officials, preachers, but others were lost. The midwives, the caregivers, the domestic workers, the ones who bore the brunt without recognition. And yet, through letters, marginalia, oral traditions, fragments survived. A 14th century woman in France wrote of burying her siblings with her own hands. A 17th century man in Mexico painted himself in a mural, masked and kneeling beside a dying priest. A 19th century servant in Cairo wrote in her journal of her employer's family fleeing, leaving her behind to tend the sick alone. These fragments, scattered but insistent, stitched together a broader picture of how pandemics were not only lived, but shaped by those without power. And as the world grew more interconnected, those margins expanded. In the 21st century, cell phone videos, voice memos, anonymous posts captured what official reports could not. The moment a nurse broke down in a supply closet, the way a child pressed a hand to a nursing home window, the way a delivery worker navigated deserted streets with a cloth mask and a handwritten note tucked in a pocket that read, "Please don't cough." These moments, mundane and profound, gave texture to the vast abstraction of global crisis. And texture mattered because it reminded people that statistics were made of bodies, of families, of stories paused. In museums and archives, curators began collecting not just medical data, but grocery lists, protest signs, screenshots of text chains from the early days of lockdowns. They understood that history was not only made in the headlines, but in the space where someone boiled rice for a neighbour, or played violin on a rooftop, or filmed a tutorial for making cloth masks out of old t-shirts. These were the artefacts of the moment, and like clay tablets and plague diaries and ancient amulets before them, they spoke to a need not just to survive, but to be seen. The act of recording was itself resistance, a refusal to let the moment be flattened into a line on a graph. And in that refusal lay the heartbeat of collective memory. Every time a generation faced pestilence, it chose what to carry forward, what to forget, and what to transform. In some cases, taboos shifted. HIV changed how intimacy was discussed, how risk was understood. In others, labour and care were re-evaluated, COVID redefined essential work, revealing how invisible some workers had been until their absence threatened the whole. In every case, culture absorbed the shock and responded. Art flourished after the Black Death, sometimes obsessed with mortality, sometimes escaping it. Literature born of cholera spoke to longing, to absence, to resilience. The music of pandemic eras often turned inward. Solo instruments, minor keys, lyrics about distance and loss. These were not coincidences, but reflections of collective psyche, shaped by the rhythms of survival. And as those rhythms echoed, the world's memory deepened. Not linearly, not cleanly, but in layers like rings in a tree, each one shaped by the storm that passed over it. Those layers held stories, and the stories held lessons, and the lessons, when remembered, became warnings, soft but urgent, like a hand on the shoulder in the dark. And so the warnings piled up, not as alarms, but as quiet echoes, the kind that sit just beneath awareness, a lingering hum from the past reminding those willing to listen that what had happened could happen again. Not identically, but unmistakably. And in the stillness between crises, there was always that uneasy peace, the kind that settles in when a room has been tidied too fast, when the air has yet to exhale what it's been holding. And in that stillness, civilizations tried to tell themselves they had learned that their tools were sharper now, their minds clearer, their systems better rehearsed. And in some ways this was true. Disease mapping had advanced, genetic sequencing took hours instead of decades, collaborative research spanned oceans in seconds. But preparedness on paper was not the same as readiness in the marrow, and as the future loomed, uncertain and alive, with its own potential pathogens, questions emerged not only about science but about will, about memory, about the capacity of societies to prioritise long-term survival over short-term convenience. People debated masks, mandates, funding, freedom, the same way they always had, only now the platforms were digital and the reach global, and misinformation became not just a nuisance, but a force of its own, mutating faster than any virus, feeding off uncertainty, distrust, fatigue. And fatigue, more than any other symptom, became the true adversary in the long tail of modern pandemics. Fatigue with caution, with compassion, with patience. It frayed the edges of communities, already strained, chipped away at the bonds that had held during the worst of it. And in its place came restlessness, the hunger to move on, to forget, to name it over, even when it was not. But memory doesn't follow instruction. It lingers in corners, shows up in the body, in the unexpected flinch at a crowded room, in the way a person still turns their face when someone nearby coughs, in the tension that remains even as the rules relax. And so, the post-pandemic world is never truly post. It is altered, it is recalibrated, it holds the fingerprints of what came before in the dust of daily life. Architects reconsider ventilation, teachers reconsider classroom layouts, travellers pack masks alongside passports, hospitals revise intake protocols, and in homes, people tell stories, not always detailed, not always solemn, sometimes even with laughter, but stories nonetheless, stories that stitch the last crisis into the fabric of what now is. A child asks why grandma always carries hand sanitizer, and the answer becomes a portal into history. A photo is found of a wedding where half the guests attended over video call. A recipe card is pulled from a drawer, marked quarantine baking. These fragments, mundane, personal, unassuming, become the vessels of lived memory, the real archive of what it meant to survive. And across that archive, across all the chapters of plague and pandemic, a pattern becomes clear, that what people feared most was not only death, but disconnection. That the most painful part was not always the fever, but the distance, the not being able to hold a hand, to say goodbye, to sit close in grief. And so every time the world restarted, people rushed back to each other, to concerts, to churches, to cafes, to crowded beaches, and tight hugs and murmured conversations over drinks. The return was never about denying the past, but about defying the loneliness it imposed. And that defiance, subtle and essential, became the defining trait of every recovery. It echoed in the way people sang together through masks, the way volunteers lined up to distribute food, the way strangers nodded to each other in grocery aisles when shelves were bare. It was not heroism as grand gesture, but as quiet presence. It was staying, helping, listening, believing in a future that was not yet visible. And through that belief, new frameworks emerged, not just for health, but for equity, for justice, for understanding that vulnerability is not evenly distributed. The poorest always fell hardest, the most marginalised bore the heaviest burden. And yet it was often these communities that showed the deepest resilience, the most generous care, the strongest networks of mutual aid. This too became part of the pandemic story. Not just who died, but who was abandoned, who was remembered, who rebuilt. Because history is not only a record of events, but a ledger of values, and every pandemic revealed what a society cherished and what it neglected. In some places the elderly were protected, in others discarded. In some times art was nourished, in others censored. In some contexts truth was elevated, in others obscured. The virus only exploited what was already there. It did not create injustice, but it illuminated it. It did not invent fear, but it amplified it. And when the wave passed, the landscape it left behind was never neutral. It bore the imprint of every choice made during the crisis. The walls repainted, the memorials erected, the policies rewritten, or not. And amid that reconstruction, there was always the same quiet question, barely spoken, but always felt. Will we remember next time? Not just the facts, but the feeling. Not just the data, but the dread, the care, the hope. Because pandemics are not singular events. They are accumulations. They layer over each other, each one reshaping the memory of the last, each one redefining what it means to be vulnerable, to be prepared, to be alive together. And so with each generation standing on the remnants of the last, the story of life during pandemics remains both unfinished and deeply rooted, carried not just in books and museums and documentaries, but in the way people pause at the sound of a cough, in the hesitancy that lingers when entering a crowded room, in the instinct to check a forehead for fever with the back of a hand, a gesture passed down. Not through instruction, but through observation, through repetition, through care. The legacy of pandemics is not only death, not only fear, but adaptation, a rewiring of how to live, how to trust, how to wait. Waiting has always been central to the experience, waiting for symptoms, for letters, for recovery, for news, for a return to what was or the arrival of what would be. During the long quarantines of history, people measured time in ways that changed them. Monks copied texts in silence, while cities fell ill beyond the monastery walls. Families in Florence read psalms aloud each evening, not just for comfort, but to mark the passing of another day untouched by plague. Sailors confined on quarantine ships watched the shoreline without knowing if they would ever walk it again. Prisoners of infection, all of them, in different forms of stillness, looking outward and inward at once. And while the body fought or failed, the mind travelled through prayer, story, imagination. In that solitude, new forms of creativity emerged, and even as death drew near, people painted, wrote, composed, reflected. The 1606 closure of London's theatres during plague years sent Shakespeare into new genres, birthing works that turned private anguish into shared expression. Centuries later, artists in lockdown apartments stitched digital collages, wrote music in minor chords, filmed dance performances on balconies overlooking empty squares. Always, the creative impulse persisted, not in denial of the suffering, but in communion with it, as if to say, even now, we remain human. That too was a kind of immunity, not to disease but to despair, And while the sciences raced toward vaccines, while logistics moved supplies, while policies battled over guidelines and freedoms, the emotional infrastructure of pandemic life was built quietly by ordinary hands. The neighbour who left groceries on a doorstep, the friend who checked in every morning, the stranger who offered a mask when someone else forgot theirs. These gestures, small and constant, made daily life bearable, even beautiful, even in its brokenness. And when the world opened again, those moments remained embedded in how people approached one another, more aware of fragility, more attuned to care, more reverent of space and breath and presence. And still, the memory dulled, as it always does, softened by time, reshaped by retellings. The children who lived through one pandemic would grow into adults who half remembered the fear, who knew the protocols but not the reason behind them, who kept a mask in a drawer just in case, but didn't think about why until something stirred again in the world's bloodstream. The cycle would start not in panic, but in patterns, a new strain, a warming climate that stirred old pathogens, a shift in animal populations, a mutation too fast to contain. And again the past would rise, not just in response plans, but in instinct. People would scan news articles with a familiar chill. They would reach for hand sanitizer without being told. They would worry first about the elderly, about the immunocompromised, about the ones who could not afford to get sick. And in those first moments of uncertainty, when governments hesitated and rumours ran fast, the memory of before would whisper, "Do not wait, do not pretend, do not turn away." Because now the world knew, or at least could not claim ignorance. It had lived this once and twice and 10 times over. The names had changed. Justinianic, bubonic, influenza, AIDS, SARS, COVID, but the arc remained. And what had once been scattered across centuries was now compressed into living memory, archived not just in dusty books, but in digital clouds, in shared code, in globally connected minds. The challenge would no longer be knowledge, but will. The ability to act before the worst, to value prevention over cure, to extend care beyond borders and timelines. Because pandemics do not end when the last patient recovers. They end when the systems that allowed them to spread are transformed. When housing is stable, when healthcare is equitable, when science is trusted, when history is remembered. Until then, they pause, they wait, they adapt, just like us. And perhaps that is the most human part of all, the mirroring. That in each pathogen strategy of survival, we see something of our own, the drive to persist, to replicate stories, and rituals and memories, to find hosts not just in bodies, but in minds. And so the final truth is not one of doom, but of entanglement. We are part of this world, not above it. We breathe the same air as the bats in the cave, as the traders on the Silk Road, as the dancers in plague-ridden squares, as the nurses in makeshift I See Us. Our lungs connect us, our breath connects us, and in that connection lies both the danger and the possibility. Because if we can carry illness to one another, we can also carry care. And it is that care, quiet, persistent, imperfect, that has always brought the world through to the other side.